The morning sun rested softly on the small town, painting the trees in shades of gold and orange. The world seemed calm, almost too calm for a man who had spent most of his life surrounded by noise and chaos. He had come to this quiet place for peace. After years of serving in places where every sound meant danger, he had promised himself he would find silence somewhere, someday. Now he had it. His small wooden house sat at the edge of town, surrounded by tall pine trees that whispered when the wind passed through them. He had built the porch himself, slow and steady, like someone learning to breathe again after being underwater for too long. His days were simple. He woke up early, made black coffee, and watched the world come alive outside his window. Then he would whistle softly, and from inside the house came his best friend, Shadow. Shadow was a black German shepherd with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm strength about him. He wasn't like most dogs in the neighborhood. He never barked without reason, never jumped at strangers, and always seemed to understand what his owner was thinking before a word was spoken. The two had been together for years. They had trained side by side, lived through danger together, and survived things that most people would only hear about in stories. But now all of that was behind them. In this quiet life, they didn't need words. When the man sat on the porch with his coffee, Shadow would lie down beside him, his head resting near the man's boot. It was a silent friendship built on years of trust. The people in town didn't know much about him. They only saw a quiet man who kept to himself. He didn't go to the bar. He didn't talk much at the grocery store. He greeted people politely, but never stayed long for conversation. Some called him mysterious. Others said he was just private. In truth, he simply didn't know how to be around too many people anymore. The noise of the world still made him tense. What most people didn't know was that before he came here, he had served in the military for many years. Not just any unit, he was part of one of the most skilled and secretive groups that existed. He had seen places where the line between life and death was thinner than a shadow. He had done things that haunted his dreams. That was why he left. He didn't want medals, attention, or pity. He just wanted peace, and he found it in this small town with Shadow by his side. Each morning they walked down the gravel road leading into the forest. The man liked the smell of the pine needles, the sound of leaves crunching under his boots, and the soft rhythm of Shadow's paws, keeping pace beside him. They didn't need to go far. Just walking through the woods felt like a kind of therapy. Sometimes he would stop near a stream, toss a stick into the water, and watch Shadow swim to fetch it, his dark fur glistening as he returned. For a man who had once lived with constant alertness, these quiet walks were healing. He no longer needed to look over his shoulder. The forest didn't hide danger. It hid peace. One afternoon, he sat on the porch repairing a section of the wooden fence that surrounded his small yard. Shadow lay nearby, watching every movement with interest. The man smiled softly, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Almost done, boy," he murmured. Shadow wagged his tail as if he understood. That fence had been repaired many times. Shadow liked to push his head through the boards to watch the street. Sometimes kids passing by would wave, and Shadow would wag his tail back at them. He never hurt anyone. The neighbors had come to recognize the dog as gentle and well-behaved, but that afternoon one of the fence boards had loosened more than usual. The man told himself he'd fix it properly in the morning. He didn't know that decision would change everything. The next day started like any other. The sun rose, the coffee brewed, and the town came alive slowly. The man had gone into town early to pick up some supplies. He trusted that Shadow would be fine at home for a short while. He always was. He had trained Shadow to stay calm, to guard the property and never harm anyone. But the wind was strong that morning. It pushed against the weak fence until one of the boards gave way. Shadow, curious and excited, squeezed through the gap and wandered out. He didn't run far, just across the small street where a few houses stood. He sniffed the grass, wagged his tail at a mail carrier, and then trotted along the sidewalk. To him, it was a small adventure, nothing more. However, one neighbor, seeing a large black dog loose, grew nervous. She didn't know Shadow or his nature. She called the local authorities, reporting a big aggressive dog roaming near the houses. Her voice trembled on the phone, and her fear carried through her words. The dispatcher marked it as urgent. Within minutes, 2 police officers were sent to the scene. It was a quiet morning, so the call felt simple, a stray or dangerous dog report. They pulled up near the corner and saw Shadow standing on the sidewalk, ears perked. tail wagging slightly. From a distance, his size and dark coat made him look intimidating. The officers didn't know he belonged to anyone nearby. They didn't know he had been trained to protect, not harm. They didn't know his owner had spent years serving the same nation they wore the badge for. All they saw was a large dog standing alert. Shadow barked once, loud but not angry, more of a warning sound that said, "I don't know you." The bark made the officers tense. One of them stepped forward, calling out, "Hey there, boy." Easy, but his partner grew cautious. The situation escalated too quickly, as fear often does when understanding is missing. Meanwhile, the man was driving home, humming quietly to himself, unaware of what was unfolding just a few streets away. Back at the scene, Shadow stood his ground, tail stiff but still. He didn't charge, didn't attack. But in that moment, the officer's judgment clouded. One misread movement led to another reaction. What happened next would stay burned in the man's heart forever. When he turned onto his street, he noticed the flashing lights before anything else. His stomach tightened. He parked the truck and stepped out, his heart already pounding. As he approached his gate, he saw the neighbors standing at their doors, whispering. The air felt heavy, too still. Then he saw the officers near the street and the shape lying motionless beside the curb. Time slowed down. His body froze. His brain refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. He walked closer, step by step, each one heavier than the last. When he finally reached them, one officer began to speak, but he didn't hear a single word. All he could see was Shadow, his loyal friend, the only being who had stayed with him through everything, lying there as if asleep. He knelt beside the dog, his hands trembling as he touched the fur that had once been full of life. For a long moment, no one said a word. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the sound of his breath as it caught in his throat. The officers tried to explain that they thought the dog was dangerous, that they had to act quickly, that it was just a misunderstanding. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. His training had taught him control, how to stay calm even when his world fell apart. But inside, it felt like something had been ripped out of him. He looked at the officers quietly, his eyes tired and distant. "He wouldn't have hurt anyone," he said softly, almost in a whisper. Then he lifted the dog gently into his arms. The officers didn't stop him. They didn't even know what to say. He carried Shadow back through the broken fence into the yard they had built together. The porch creaked as he stepped up, the same porch where they had sat every morning. He laid Shadow down in his favorite spot near the steps and sat beside him. The afternoon sun dipped lower and the world around him blurred. He wasn't angry at the world, not yet. He was simply hollow. The same silence he once craved now felt cruel. Neighbors watched from afar, whispering, unsure how to comfort him. They didn't know who he really was or what he had endured before coming here. To them, he was just a quiet man who had lost his dog. But to him, he had lost the last piece of his past that still made sense. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch until the stars faded and the sky began to lighten again. The air was cool and the forest beyond his house was still. He thought of all the times Shadow had followed him through danger without hesitation. He thought of the nights when only the dog's steady breathing had kept him grounded. He whispered softly, "You did good, boy. You always did good." His voice cracked as he said it. When morning came, he buried Shadow under the tall pine tree near the edge of the yard. It was a quiet place, peaceful and shaded, where sunlight broke through in small golden patches. He marked the spot with a smooth stone, nothing fancy, just a simple reminder of the loyalty and love that had once filled his life. As he stood there, hands in his pockets, the world felt heavier than it had in years. The man who had survived battles and loss now felt the deepest wound of all, not from war, but from a misunderstanding in the very place he sought peace. He didn't know yet that this moment would echo far beyond the small town. He didn't know that people would soon learn who he truly was, or that his quiet grief would open conversations about patience, understanding, and compassion. For now he only knew one thing. His best friend was gone, and the silence he once loved had never felt so loud. The days that followed felt slow and heavy. The man moved through them like someone walking through fog, unable to see where he was going, only knowing that he had to keep moving somehow. His small wooden house, once filled with quiet comfort, now felt painfully empty. Every sound reminded him of what was missing: the jingle of the leash by the door, The soft steps on the floor, the low bark when someone came near the gate. He woke up early, as always. The habit was too strong to break. For years his mornings had started before sunrise, when the world was still half asleep. But now when he made his coffee and stepped out onto the porch, the silence pressed harder against his chest. He looked at the yard where Shadow used to run, at the pine tree where he had buried him, and felt the kind of sadness that had no words. The neighbors had stopped by at first, trying to offer comfort. Some brought food, others offered a few quiet words, but he didn't say much in return. He thanked them politely and went back inside. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate their kindness. He just didn't know how to talk about what he felt. For a long time he stayed away from town. He didn't want to see the street where it happened. He didn't want to see the people looking at him with sympathy or curiosity. He just stayed home, spending hours sitting near the pine tree. Sometimes he spoke softly to the ground, telling Shadow about his day, the same way he used to talk to him before. But even in his silence, something started to grow inside him. Not anger, not yet, but confusion. He couldn't understand why things had happened that way. Shadow had never hurt anyone. He had trusted that the world outside his gate was safe, but it had proven otherwise. A few days later, there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, two men stood there, one in uniform, the other wearing a plain shirt with a notepad in his hand. They introduced themselves from the local police department. Their visit was meant to be a follow-up, an official conversation about the incident. He invited them in, though his body tensed as he did. Old instincts stirred inside him, years of training that taught him how to read people, how to stay alert even when calm. They sat at the small wooden table near the window. The officer spoke first, explaining their side of the story. He said the responding officers had acted according to protocol, believing there was a threat. He said it was a tragic misunderstanding. He said all the right words, but none of them could undo what had been done. The man listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice. When the officer finished, he simply asked one question. Did they try to find out who the dog belonged to before? The officer hesitated. There wasn't enough time, he replied. That was all the man needed to hear. He nodded slowly and thanked them for stopping by. When they left, he stood by the window for a long time, watching their car disappear down the road. His mind was full, but his face stayed calm. Later that night, he sat outside again. The wind rustled through the trees and the air smelled like rain. He thought about all the times he had faced danger far from home, and how strange it felt that this quiet town, the place he thought would heal him, had taken more from him than any battlefield ever had. Still, he wasn't angry at the world. He told himself that anger would only make the pain last longer. But deep down, something had shifted. He started thinking about fairness, about how easily people made decisions when they were afraid, about how often those decisions hurt others. A week passed before he left the house again. He drove into town to pick up groceries. As he parked near the store, he noticed a few people glancing at him. News travels fast in small towns. They all knew what had happened. A woman by the entrance stopped him and said, "I'm so sorry about your dog." Her voice trembled. He nodded, managing a small smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. Inside the store, the cashier asked if he was doing all right. He said he was fine, though they both knew it wasn't true, but it was easier to say that than to explain the storm inside him. When he got home, he placed the groceries on the table and found a small envelope in his mailbox. It was from the local newspaper. Inside was a short letter from a reporter who wanted to talk to him about the incident. They had heard from neighbors that the officers might have acted too quickly, and they wanted to get his side of the story. He didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he wanted to relive it again, especially not for the public. But that night he thought about it more. Maybe, he thought, telling the truth could prevent it from happening to someone else. Maybe it could make people understand. The next morning he called the number. The reporter's voice was polite, cautious. They met later that day at a small coffee shop in town. He didn't share everything, just enough. He spoke about Shadow, how he was trained, how calm and loyal he had always been. He explained how he wasn't home that morning and how the situation had been misunderstood. The reporter listened carefully, taking notes, but near the end of their talk she asked something unexpected. You mentioned training, she said softly. Were you in the military? For a moment he said nothing. He didn't usually talk about that part of his life. But then he nodded. Yes, he said quietly. A long time ago. She asked which branch, and he hesitated again before replying. Army, he said simply. He didn't go into details. He didn't need to. When the story was published a few days later, it was titled, A Veteran's Loss, When a Loyal Friend is Mistaken for a Threat. It was a respectful piece, not dramatic, just honest. The article mentioned that he had served his country for many years and had chosen this quiet town for peace. It didn't give away where exactly he had served or what he had done, but it mentioned his discipline, his calmness, and his dignity even in loss. The story spread quickly online. People in the town read it, then people beyond it. Comments poured in, some expressing sorrow, others anger, many showing support. A few veterans reached out to him, sharing similar stories about loss and misunderstanding. He read every message quietly, unsure how to respond. Then, one morning, he got a call from a man he hadn't heard from in years. A familiar voice on the other end said, I saw the article. Didn't expect to see your face in the news again. It was an old teammate, someone who had served with him during his Delta Force years. They talked for a while, sharing small memories, avoiding the heavy ones. Before hanging up, his friend said, You should let people know who you are. Maybe then they'll understand. He didn't want attention, but his friend's words stayed with him. People only saw a quiet man who lost his dog. They didn't know the years of training, the patience, the strength it took not to react in anger. Maybe, he thought, it was time people learned what real restraint looked like. Soon after, another journalist reached out, this time from a larger news outlet. They wanted to do a story about the incident and his military background. He agreed reluctantly. The interview was calm and thoughtful. He didn't speak of revenge or hatred. Instead, he spoke about control, empathy, and understanding. He said fear often leads people to act too quickly and that the cost of such moments can last forever. When the story aired, it reached millions. People were moved by his quiet dignity. They learned that the man whose dog had been killed was not just any veteran. He had been part of one of the most elite and disciplined units in the military. The idea that someone like him could face such an injustice made people question the way quick judgments were made in society. For the man, fame wasn't the goal. He never liked attention. But something unexpected began to happen. Letters started arriving from people across the country, officers, veterans, even young recruits. They wrote about how his story had made them think differently, how it reminded them to stay calm, to ask questions before reacting, to see people and animals with more patience. He didn't realize it at first, but through his grief he had begun to heal others. One evening, he sat on his porch again, looking at the pine tree where Shadow rested. The sky was turning pink, the same color it often turned when they used to walk together. He felt a quiet strength returning to him. He thought about how Shadow had always been calm in danger because he had taught him that way. And now, it was Shadow's lesson guiding him through this pain. In the distance, he could hear children playing, birds calling, and the faint hum of the town settling down for the night. Life was moving on as it always did, but something in him had changed. He no longer felt like just a man who lost his dog. He felt like someone who could turn pain into purpose. He didn't know yet how, but he felt that this wasn't the end of the story. Something inside him was stirring again, the part that once believed in missions and doing something that mattered. This time the mission wasn't about fighting enemies. It was about helping people understand each other better. As he sat there in the fading light, he whispered softly, "We're not done yet." Boy, the wind moved through the trees gently, almost like a response. For the first time since that terrible day, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The pain was still there, but now it carried something else with it. Purpose. Days turned into weeks, and though life around him moved forward, time inside the man's world seemed to stand still. His story had reached people far beyond his small town, and yet he still lived quietly, following the same simple routines. He didn't care about the attention, the interviews, or the messages flooding in. He still woke up early, made his coffee, and sat on the porch where Shadow used to rest his head. That part of his life hadn't changed and never would. But something inside him had. The silence didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was still painful, but now it carried a strange sense of meaning. People were listening, not just to the story of what had happened, but to what he represented, a voice of calmness in a world full of noise. Letters continued to arrive every day. Some came from strangers who simply wanted to express sympathy. Others came from people who had been through similar heartbreaks, veterans, police officers, even families who had lost pets in misunderstandings. He read every one of them carefully, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes wiping away quiet tears when a story touched too close to home. One letter stood out among them. It came from a small-town police officer from another state. The officer wrote, "Your story changed how I think when I'm in the field. I realized fear can make us blind. I'm trying to do better now." That letter stayed on his kitchen table for days. Every time he passed it, he looked at it again. It reminded him that something good had come out of all this pain. He still didn't go out much, but now when he did, people greeted him differently. Some looked at him with admiration, others with quiet respect. A few wanted to shake his hand or thank him for speaking out. He didn't always know how to respond, but he appreciated the warmth. One morning, the town mayor called. She said she wanted to meet him, to talk about organizing a small community event honoring local veterans. At first, he refused. He didn't like attention or standing in front of people, but after thinking it over, he realized maybe this was something he should do. Not for recognition, but to share something that mattered. The event was held in the town park, under a canopy of oak trees. People gathered holding small flags and listening quietly as the mayor spoke about service, discipline, and understanding. Then she invited him to say a few words. He walked to the small stage, his hands steady but his heart heavy. He didn't have a written speech. He just spoke from the heart. "I never wanted to stand here," he began softly. "I came to this town to find peace, not attention. But life has a way of testing what we believe in. I lost something I loved deeply, and for a long time I asked myself why. I realized it wasn't about blame, it was about understanding. Fear can make people react without thinking, but patience can save lives. Sometimes we just need to take a breath before we act." The crowd was silent, every word sinking in. He continued, "I don't hold anger toward anyone, but I do hope we all learn from it. If sharing my story helps even one person stop, think, and choose compassion over fear, then maybe it means my friend's life still has purpose." When he finished, the crowd stood in quiet applause. He didn't smile or wave. He simply nodded and stepped down, feeling lighter than he had in months. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he sat on his porch again. The town lights flickered in the distance, and the air felt cool and calm. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. He could almost sense shadow beside him, like an invisible presence keeping watch. Over the next few weeks, more invitations came, requests from schools, police departments, and community groups asking him to speak about control, patience, and emotional discipline. He turned down most of them at first, but one invitation caught his eye. It was from a nearby police academy. They wanted him to share his experience and teach about communication in tense situations. He thought about it for days. He had spent most of his life training for war, not peace. Yet maybe this was the next step, teaching others how to stay calm when fear tries to take control. He accepted the invitation. When he arrived at the academy, the recruits stood in neat rows. The air smelled of fresh uniforms and nervous energy. The instructor greeted him warmly, then introduced him to the group. "This is a man who's lived both sides of the line," he said. "Listen carefully." The man looked at their young faces, some eager, some uncertain, some already hardened by the idea of authority. He began slowly, choosing each word with care. "In my time, I learned that the hardest thing isn't pulling a trigger," he said quietly. "It's choosing not to." The room stayed silent. He continued, "When fear hits, your training takes over. That's good, but it's not enough. You need heart. You need empathy. You need to look at a situation and ask yourself, am I reacting to danger or to my own fear?" He told them about shadow, not the painful details, but the lessons he learned from it. He explained how one decision made in fear could change countless lives. He didn't blame anyone, but he wanted them to feel the weight of their responsibility. By the time he finished, the room was still. Some of the young officers wiped their eyes quietly. The instructor came forward, shaking his hand. "You said more in 10 minutes than most people learn in a career," he said. That night, as he drove home, the moonlight followed him along the winding road through the forest. He rolled down the window and let the cool air fill the truck. For once, he felt like he was doing something right again, something that mattered. Word spread quickly about his talk at the academy. Soon, other departments reached out, inviting him to speak. He didn't see himself as a teacher, but somehow that's what he had become. He began organizing small sessions. Nothing official, just honest conversations between veterans and officers. He called it the Quiet Line. The name came from his belief that true strength lives in stillness, not aggression. At first, only a few people attended. But each time more came. Some officers brought their families. Some veterans brought their dogs. They shared stories, pain, and laughter. Slowly, these gatherings became a bridge between people who had once stood on opposite sides of fear. The man didn't seek payment or recognition. He just wanted to make sure that what happened to him in shadow wouldn't happen to anyone else. He even trained a few young officers in canine behavior, teaching them how to read dogs' body language, how to stay calm in moments of uncertainty. The more he gave to the community, the more he healed. It didn't erase the loss, but it gave it meaning. He began to sleep better. He started visiting the park again. Sometimes when children played with their dogs nearby, he'd smile quietly, remembering the days when Shadow used to run free under the same sky. Then one afternoon, while he was fixing the old fence again, a familiar vehicle pulled up near his house. 2 officers stepped out, the same ones from that terrible day. His heart tightened, but he didn't move. They walked slowly toward him, their faces heavy with guilt and uncertainty. One of them spoke first. "Sir, we came here to say we're sorry. We didn't know who you were back then. We didn't know what your dog meant to you. We've both thought about it every day since." He looked at them quietly. There was no anger left in his eyes, only calm. "You don't need to apologize for not knowing who I was," he said softly. "You just needed to see who he was." The younger officer's voice shook. "We've changed how we handle calls now. We're learning from it." He nodded. "That's what matters." There was a long silence between them, not tense, just human. Then he extended his hand. The officers hesitated, then shook it. In that moment, years of pain seemed to lift. After they left, he sat on the porch again, staring at the pine tree. The light of the setting sun painted everything gold. He felt peace, not the fragile kind he'd searched for after war, but the deeper peace that comes from acceptance. That night, he wrote in his notebook, something he hadn't done in years. He wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to let pain control you." He closed the book and placed it beside Shadow's collar, which still hung near the window. In the weeks that followed, the Quiet Line grew into something larger. Local news covered their sessions, calling them a bridge between courage and compassion. He didn't like the spotlight, but he understood it was helping others, so he stayed with it. Soon, other communities started similar programs, using his approach as a model. People began referring to him as a mentor, a title he never asked for but one he quietly honored. Sometimes when he walked through town, people would stop to thank him. Children would wave. Dogs would run up to him, wagging their tails. He'd kneel down, pet them gently, and smile, always thinking of Shadow. He knew he could never bring his friend back, but he also knew that Shadow's spirit lived on, not through sadness, but through every life touched by the lessons they left behind. One evening, as the wind rustled through the trees, he whispered toward the pine tree, "You did your job well, boy. We both did." The branches swayed gently, as if answering. He sat there for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one. Somewhere deep in his heart, the pain had softened into peace. The man who once lived for battle had found a new kind of mission, one built not on strength or fear, but on understanding. And this time, he wasn't alone. The days that followed felt like a blur for him. The house felt heavier than ever before. Every time he opened the door, he half expected to see his dog running to greet him like before. But the silence always waited instead, quiet and sharp enough to make his chest ache. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't listen to the radio, and didn't answer his phone. He simply moved through the house like a man walking through a dream he didn't want to be in. Neighbors passed by sometimes, unsure of what to say. A few of them left small notes on his porch or flowers near the gate. He didn't throw them away, but he also didn't pick them up. He didn't have the words to thank anyone. He wasn't angry at them. He was just tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. 3 days later, he finally went to the local animal shelter with a small box. Inside it were Shadow's collar, tags, and the leash they had used for years. The staff member behind the counter recognized him and hesitated. She had seen the story going around online, the story about a man whose dog was shot by mistake. It had started as a small local post, but soon people began sharing it across social media. The post had no details about his background. It only mentioned a loyal pet, a misunderstanding, and an owner left heartbroken. The woman looked at him and spoke softly. "I'm so sorry about your dog." He just nodded. "He was a good one," he said quietly. That was all he could manage. When he stepped back outside, he noticed a reporter waiting near the parking lot. A young man with a camera on his shoulder approached him, looking cautious. "Sir, I'm from the local paper. I understand if you don't want to talk, but people are really moved by what happened. They'd like to hear from you, your side of things." He paused. There was a part of him that wanted to walk away, to disappear again into the quiet life he had built. But there was also another part, one that whispered that maybe telling the truth wasn't just for himself. It could stop something like this from happening again. Still, he didn't want pity. "There's not much to say," he said. "He was my friend. He didn't deserve that." The reporter nodded, respectful. "We'll make sure people understand that." That short quote made its way into the paper the next morning. It was just a few lines, but somehow those few words touched people. They saw a man who had lost something pure and unfairly. Within hours, hundreds of comments appeared online, some angry at the police, others offering support, many saying how sorry they were. A few days later, someone recognized him from an old photograph that appeared with the article. A man who had once served with him overseas saw the image and reached out to the reporter. That was the moment everything began to change. The reporter called him again. "Sir, I was contacted by someone who says he knows you from your military days. He said you were part of a special operations unit." He didn't respond at first. He had kept that part of his life private for years. To him it was the past, something that didn't need to be part of who he was anymore. But the reporter continued gently. "He just wanted people to know you've served this country in ways most can't imagine. He said it's only fair that the public knows who you are." That night he thought about it for a long time. He didn't care about fame or recognition. What mattered to him was truth. And if telling the truth about who he was could make people see the bigger picture, maybe it was worth it. By the next morning, the full story was out. The newspapers now described him not just as a grieving dog owner, but as a highly decorated Delta Force veteran who had served in multiple missions overseas. They spoke of his bravery, his leadership, and how he had quietly built a peaceful life after years of service. The reaction was instant. News channels picked up the story. Commentators expressed shock that someone who had risked his life for the country had been treated so carelessly in his own neighborhood. Social media flooded with messages of support and sympathy. Strangers called him a hero, even though that was the last thing he wanted to be called. He didn't go online to see the reactions, but his friends began to call. Some were from his old unit, others from the community. One of them said, "You didn't deserve what happened. None of this should have gone this way. People are behind you." He didn't know how to respond. He was grateful, but he didn't want to be the center of attention. Still, something about all of it started to heal a small part of him, not because people praised him, but because they finally understood that this wasn't just a story about a dog. It was about carelessness, about what happens when fear takes over understanding. Meanwhile, the local police department began facing questions from the press. Reporters stood outside their station asking about the shooting, about the officer's judgment, about why it happened at all. The department released a statement saying it was a tragic misunderstanding and that they were reviewing their procedures. For days, the town was divided. Some people defended the police, saying mistakes happen. Others demanded accountability. But amid all the noise, the man stayed quiet. He didn't want anger to lead to more pain. He knew what it felt like to lose control in high-pressure moments. He had seen good people make bad decisions when they were scared or untrained. He didn't excuse it, but he understood it. A week later, the police chief reached out and asked to meet privately. It wasn't a public gesture, it was personal. The chief came to his home, stood on the porch, and looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I know nothing I say can make this right," the chief said. "We failed you. We failed your dog. I want you to know we're taking this seriously. We're reviewing our training methods. I'm deeply sorry." The man listened quietly. He could see the guilt in the chief's eyes. There was no anger left in him, only sadness. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again," he said simply. "That's all I ask," the chief nodded. "We will." After that meeting, something shifted. He began to feel that maybe his pain could mean something if it changed even one thing for the better. He started to think about what he could do, not as revenge, but as a lesson. He thought about how much fear drove people, and how often that fear came from misunderstanding, from lack of connection. He thought about his time in the military, how every mission depended on trust, clear communication, and calm judgment. He began to see a bridge that needed to be built between those who serve the country and those who protect it at home. One evening, while sitting on his porch, he took out a small notebook and began writing ideas. They weren't big plans, just thoughts. "Training together," he wrote. "Veterans and police sharing experiences. Teaching emotional control. Understanding fear." He didn't know if anyone would listen, but the more he wrote, the lighter he felt. A few weeks later, he spoke to the same reporter again and shared his idea. The reporter loved it and helped connect him with a few local veterans groups. Soon, small meetings began happening. First just a few people, then more. Veterans shared what they'd learned in high-stress environments, how to stay calm under pressure, how to read situations instead of reacting. Police officers shared their own challenges, the split-second choices they had to make. Slowly, understanding began to grow between them. He never wanted credit for it. He didn't even want his name on the program. He just wanted people to learn to pause, to breathe, to think before acting. The local paper ran another story, not about loss this time, but about what came out of it. They wrote about how a man's pain turned into something that might save lives in the future. People from neighboring towns started reaching out, asking if they could bring the same program to their areas. He always said yes. When he looked back months later, he realized that the event that had broken his heart had also reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten: his purpose. He had spent years serving quietly, and maybe now this was his new mission. He often still missed his dog. That part never went away. Some nights he would still wake up expecting to hear the familiar sound of paws on the floor. But when those moments came, he'd close his eyes and whisper, "We're doing good, boy. You didn't go for nothing." People in town began to see him differently too. They no longer looked at him with pity, but with quiet respect. Even the officers who had once avoided his street came to some of the training sessions. They shook his hand, thanked him, and told him they'd never forget the lesson his story taught them. He didn't hold grudges. He simply nodded and said, "Just make sure you see before you act." Life slowly found rhythm again. The mornings felt calmer. The air didn't hurt as much. He started planting flowers in the yard, something he'd never done before. When a neighbor stopped by one afternoon to thank him for what he was doing for the community, he smiled genuinely for the first time in months. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was a life that meant something, and that was enough. Months had passed since the incident that changed everything. The quiet life he had built, once broken by tragedy, now carried a subtle new rhythm. He still woke early, brewed his black coffee, and stepped onto the porch, but the mornings no longer felt hollow. The air seemed lighter, almost welcoming, as if it knew he had survived not just loss, but the weight of misunderstanding and fear. The small town around him continued its gentle pace. People went about their days, children played in the parks, and neighbors smiled as they passed by. He didn't seek attention, but he noticed the way their eyes followed him now, not with curiosity or pity, but with respect and quiet recognition. Even the local police seemed different. Officers he had never spoken to before nodded politely when he walked past, some offering brief words of thanks or acknowledgement. It was not a fame he craved nor a hero's welcome. It was something quieter and more profound. In the yard, the pine tree where Shadow rested cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. He would often stand beneath it, hands in his pockets, looking at the small stone marker he had placed months ago. He could almost feel Shadow's presence, calm and steadfast, reminding him that loyalty and love endure beyond the limits of life itself. He had returned to some old routines that gave him comfort. The walks along the forest paths, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, the smell of damp earth after rain. These were reminders that life continued, fragile and resilient. But he had also found a new rhythm, helping others. The quiet line, the small initiative he had started to bring veterans and officers together, continued to grow. Sessions were held in local halls, police academies, and community centers. Veterans shared their experiences of discipline, patience, and calm under pressure. Officers spoke of split-second decisions, fear, and responsibility. At first, these gatherings were small, sometimes just a handful of people, but slowly word spread and attendance grew. People came not only to learn but to understand, to connect, and to build bridges across experiences that were often separated by fear. He didn't see himself as a teacher. He was just a man who had lived through the consequences of a split-second decision and understood how easily life could change when fear replaced understanding. And yet, quietly, he became a guide for others, a reminder that calm, empathy, and thoughtfulness can transform even the most difficult situations. One afternoon, a letter arrived at his home that caught him by surprise. It was from a police department several states away, thanking him for sharing his story. They had implemented a new training program for officers based directly on the principles he had shared. The letter said, "Your experience and calm approach are saving lives. Thank you for showing us the power of patience." He read it several times, letting the words sink in. Shadow would have wagged his tail at this moment, proud and silent, sensing that something meaningful had grown from loss. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the shelf, a quiet acknowledgement that even in sorrow, purpose could emerge. The man had begun to rebuild his own life as well. The house no longer felt empty. He had planted small flower beds near the porch and the fence, a simple act that brought him unexpected joy. The colors of the flowers reminded him of mornings he and Shadow had shared, running through fields and forests, chasing sticks and laughter. He didn't speak of them often, but the act of nurturing life in this way felt like a tribute to the friend he had lost. Evenings became times of reflection. He often sat beneath the pine tree, notebook in hand, writing not for anyone else but for himself. Sometimes he wrote stories about his experiences, sometimes lessons he hoped others could learn, and sometimes memories of Shadow, how he had always been calm, alert, and loyal. Writing became a way to release the lingering weight of grief while keeping the lessons alive. One evening, a young woman approached him in the park while he was sketching the pine tree. She held a small notebook and hesitated, clearly nervous. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I wanted to thank you. My brother is a new officer, and he attended one of your sessions. He told me it changed how he thinks. He's more patient now, more careful with his decisions. I wanted to thank you personally." He looked at her quietly, then nodded. "I'm glad it helped," he said simply. There was no need for applause, no need for accolades. Moments like these were enough. They reminded him that the lessons he had learned and that Shadow had taught him in life were continuing to make a difference. As the story of his loss and quiet resilience spread further, more people began reaching out. Journalists, local communities, and even veterans organizations. He was careful not to seek attention, but he recognized the responsibility he had to share what he had learned. Each time he spoke, he emphasized calm, understanding, and empathy over anger or revenge. He stressed that quick judgments often came from fear, and that taking a moment to pause could prevent pain and tragedy. One morning, an invitation arrived from a national veterans organization. They asked him to speak at a conference focused on mental health, emotional control, and building bridges between communities. He was hesitant at first, unsure if he was ready for such a large audience, but after thinking it over, he accepted. When he arrived at the conference, he saw hundreds of people from all over the country. Some were veterans, some were law enforcement officers, some were members of the public. The room was buzzing with energy, but he approached the podium with quiet determination. He spoke slowly, carefully, choosing each word. "I never wanted attention," he began. "I came to a quiet town for peace, and I found it in the companionship of a dog who trusted me more than anyone else. But life is unpredictable. One small decision made in fear changed everything. I am here not to speak of anger or blame, but to share what we can learn from mistakes, how to pause, to think, to act with care. Fear can make us blind. Understanding can save lives. The audience was silent, listening intently. He shared the lessons of his military experience not as a tale of heroism, but as a guide for living responsibly, thinking clearly, and acting with empathy. He described the bond with Shadow and how the loss of that friendship had changed his life in ways he never expected. When he finished, the applause was long and sincere. He didn't feel pride. He felt something more enduring, a sense of connection, a knowledge that Shadow's memory had inspired others to act differently, to consider the consequences of their choices, to see the world with more compassion. After the conference, people approached him individually. Some shared their own stories of loss, of fear, of mistakes they wished they could undo. Some simply thanked him for reminding them of the importance of calm and understanding. Each interaction reinforced a quiet truth, that even the deepest pain could become a source of hope if shared thoughtfully. Back home, he continued the daily routines that gave him comfort. He repaired the fence again, making it sturdier this time. He walked the forest trails, noting how sunlight filtered through the leaves differently in the changing seasons. He even began to teach a few children in the neighborhood how to care for animals responsibly, always emphasizing patience and observation. Through all this, Shadow remained in his thoughts, always present, guiding his actions and reminding him of the quiet strength found in loyalty and trust. He spoke of Shadow often in his sessions and writings, not as a dog but as a teacher. Shadow had taught him that calmness in the face of uncertainty, trust in those around you, and the courage to act thoughtfully could change lives. Months later, the local police department reached out again. They asked if he would help train new officers, not just in handling animals, but in recognizing stress, fear, and the importance of emotional control. He agreed. These sessions became another bridge between civilians, veterans, and law enforcement. Slowly, a culture of understanding began to take root, seeded by the quiet lessons learned from his loss. Even the neighbors noticed the change. The man who had once been a mystery to the town was now quietly respected. Children waved to him as he walked past, officers nodded, and even strangers offered smiles of recognition. He didn't seek these gestures. They were simply reminders that the world could learn, and that small actions could ripple outward in ways no one anticipated. One evening, as autumn leaves fell gently across the yard, he stood beneath the pine tree. The wind rustled softly, carrying the scent of the forest. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We did it, boy. You're still teaching, still guiding. You're not gone." He didn't feel the sharp sting of loss as intensely anymore. The grief had softened into something else, a quiet strength, a mission, and a sense of purpose that carried him forward. Shadow's presence was invisible, but it was never absent. Every act of patience he saw in others, every moment where someone paused before reacting, reminded him of the lessons he had learned and shared. In the months and years that followed, his life remained quiet but meaningful. He continued his work with the community, veterans, and law enforcement, always emphasizing empathy and calm judgment. He wrote about his experiences, though rarely published them, keeping them as guides for anyone who might need them in the future. When he walked through the forest or tended his garden, he no longer felt the crushing weight of loss. Instead, he carried Shadow's memory as a gentle reminder of love, loyalty, and the power of quiet courage. He understood now that even when life seems unfair, even when tragedy strikes unexpectedly, it can become a source of learning, growth, and hope for others. He had found peace again, not by forgetting what happened, but by using it to make the world a little kinder, a little wiser. And in that he found a purpose that even Shadow in life would have been proud to see. Even in a quiet town under the soft light of the setting sun, the man smiled. He knew that through pain, understanding had grown. Through loss, connection had blossomed. And through loyalty, love, and memory, a simple act like pausing, listening, and thinking could change lives in ways he had never imagined. The mission he had once thought ended in distant lands had found its new path here, quietly, gently, and profoundly in the hearts of those who chose to see beyond fear, to act with care, and to honor what was truly important. And so, life moved forward, steady and calm, carrying the lessons of Shadow and the quiet man who had turned sorrow into something far greater than he had ever expected, a mission of understanding, compassion, and enduring hope.